Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So today we return to Hollywood and we tackle two readings from our book. The first one is After the War. That starts on page 436. And then we're also looking at the transformation of the Hollywood system. That begins on page 443. So we have reached the end of World War II. And we are entering the 1950s in terms of our historical tour through the movies. So this is the post-war world. We have reached the middle of the 20th century, and a lot is changing. We're going to see that over the next few weeks. Movies are changing. Of course, technology continues to change and advance, but there are some big developments that we're going to spend the next couple of weeks talking about as the big Hollywood studios start to lose a little bit of their control and dominance that they've wielded for the last several decades up till this point. So we'll talk about some of that this week. We'll also be talking about some of these changes next week when we get into the new Hollywood. And obviously there's lots of changes to discuss with that. So we are kind of entering this important transition period, and a lot will be changing. And this is also appropriate for us because we are reaching the halfway point of the semester. So it's kind of a time of transition for us as well. So I will talk about the midterm essay, which you can either submit at the end of this week or at the end of next week, because next week is spring break for GBC. So we will not have any class activities during that week. So if you need some extra time to finish the essay, you can use spring break for that and submit at the end of March. But I'll talk about that near the end of lecture. Let's start with our readings, and then we'll talk about our film for this week, On the Waterfront, starring Marlon Brando, a classic of American cinema, and it also represents a lot of things that are going on during this historical time period in the 1950s. So we'll get to that as well. But again, we have reached the end of World War II, so as the book tells us, this is kind of an important revitalization time for cinema, not just American movies, but also cinema abroad, because the war has ended. We're moving back into a peacetime era, and we sort of resume the trade of film. We've talked about how Hollywood has been exporting a lot of movies abroad to many other countries, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. So that picks back up again after the war. But as the book points out, there's a little bit of a struggle going on during this period because after World War II, a lot of domestic European film industries are trying to sort of get restarted, trying to get back off the ground. And in some cases, they're a little bit reluctant to accept as many imported Hollywood movies as before because that's seen in some cases as maybe depressing local output. If most people in those countries are watching Hollywood movies, that might make there be less of a market for local domestically made movies. So there is kind of a struggle. Hollywood wants to continue to export a lot of stuff abroad, but there are movements in a lot of other countries where local filmmakers are trying to establish their own styles, their own unique methods that might be different than Hollywood. And again, you have the development of some national film industries that maybe had not been as big before the war, but they're starting to gain steam after the war. And you also have countries like France, the Soviet Union, even England, who had been pretty active film producers previously, and they are now getting back into main sort of big, major film production after the war obviously disrupted their film industries for several years. Uh, so we have new styles, new movements starting to gain steam in Europe. And we talked about that a little bit a couple of weeks ago, at least in the context of French cinema. We talked about the French New Wave, which was kind of a revolutionary movement in French film that started sort of in the late 1950s. And there are similar movements going on in other European countries, and many of those would start to influence American movies in various ways. And one thing we start to see a lot of after World War II is an increase in what we might call a sort of realistic style or realism as a style of movie making. Now, this isn't brand new. We had realistic movies before, but this is a trend that historians talk about and literary scholars talk about, film scholars. You can go back to almost any war, any major war that's been fought in the last few centuries, and almost always right after the war ends, you have a change in art. You have a change in whatever the dominant art forms are for that time period. In previous eras, it would have been mostly literature, theater, obviously by the 1950s, movies. Cinema is one of the biggest art forms. But always after a war, you have a move towards more realistic storytelling because wars have a tendency to kind of destroy a lot of our romanticized ideals, a lot of our sort of, more flights of fancy, the kinds of genres that were often popular before a major war will not always be as popular afterwards, especially if those genres are highly fictionalized, again, highly sort of stylized, clearly not tethered to reality, or if they're sort of romanticized, sort of made into something more glamorous, more beautiful, or just more sort of traditionally romantic than things really are. And after a war, people tend to be a little bit disillusioned, maybe a bit more cynical. So there's always sort of a push towards more realistic storytelling, more realistic art that can really capture what things are like for people in present conditions. So as you can imagine, in the years immediately following World War II, especially in Europe, things aren't stellar, right? A lot of places have been bombed and destroyed. A lot of people have been killed, both soldiers and civilians. So this is kind of a time of rebuilding, but also a time of maybe reflection, thinking about some of the hardships and dealing with present tense difficulties. So as a result of that, you had a lot of sort of new realistic styles that were becoming popular in a lot of European countries. One example is what's frequently called neo-realism. That just means sort of contemporary, present, new realism in Italy. Italy, like a lot of other European countries, sort of had a rough go of it during the war. Conditions were not great after the war as countries were trying to rebuild their economies. So a lot of Italian films that came out in the late 40s, early 50s were well known for being pretty gritty and very realistic, not romanticized at all. They were showing the real conditions of post-war Italy. And to do that, you needed new techniques. So Italian directors were increasingly shooting their movies on location, real locations, not using sound stages or elaborate sets like a lot of earlier movies had. Real locations, they often use non-professional actors, using more mobile cameras so they could move around, sort of altering some of their camera techniques, some of their editing techniques to better suit this material. And often these kinds of movies would feature characters struggling with a lack of money, lack of opportunity, loss of loved ones, all the sort of post-war realities that countries were dealing with. Not so much the US. Obviously, we fought in the war. We lost a lot of soldiers in the war. But the important distinction between us and Europe was the fact that the war was not fought on our soil, right? So our cities were not destroyed, right? So we didn't have many civilian deaths, and that's obviously very different from France, the UK, Italy, other places in Europe where there was a lot of fighting, obviously Germany as well, a lot of fighting, a lot of death, and a lot of destruction. So the neo-realism that was developing not just in Italy, but in other countries as well was kind of a response to that, kind of a way of trying to capture that, the real conditions that people were facing. So that was influential to U.S. filmmakers, even though we weren't dealing with quite as many hardships in this country. But that style, getting closer to the action, as sort of more authentic glimpse of human life, that proved very influential to a lot of American filmmakers, and we'll see a little bit of it in On the Waterfront. Elia Kazan, the filmmaker, Kazan, I think is how you say it. Kazan is known well for incorporating some of those neo-realism techniques from European cinema, and On the Waterfront is one of the many movies of his where you can see some of that. But despite a lot of these post-war difficulties, the 1950s was a good time for a lot of European film. We've mentioned a little bit of this again with French cinema. There were a lot of film magazines and other publications devoted to movies, both in the US and in European countries. Lots of film scholarship after World War II. That means academic studies of films, academic analysis. Film had been around long enough by this point to where we had a real academic discipline developing around it. So we had a lot of people writing about movies, both in terms of journalism and more like academic scholarship. We had fanzines that were devoted to movie stars, and we had a lot of technical innovation. We had new technology, new methods that were developing and sort of percolating throughout the 50s. And I mentioned in France the development of the auteur theory, this idea that the great movie directors were artists similar to novelists or great composers of classical music. Yes, film directors were working in a more collaborative environment, but the auteur theory said that the very best directors had their own style, their own kind of visual language that would show up in virtually all of their movies. So that was a French idea, but it often got applied to a lot of U.S. directors, but not just American directors, but a lot of directors who were working in Hollywood or had worked in Hollywood before. So I mentioned that they were big fans of Howard Hawks, who was kind of an obscure American director of like cheap westerns back in the 30s and 40s, but they loved him. They loved Orson Welles, who made Citizen Kane, a very important movie, American movie in the 1940s. They were big fans of Nicholas Ray, another American filmmaker, Alfred Hitchcock, who was British, but worked for much of his career in Hollywood. So those were some of the directors that they wrote about, talked about, and used as examples of real auteurs. John Ford was another one. We saw one of his films last week. Also, during the 50s and 60s, you had the development of some international film festivals. And that's kind of important, even if you never attend one, just in terms of the overall sort of rebuilding of movie industries after the war. And also, as the book says, there's sort of this development of more of an international film culture after the war. Again, movies have been around long enough. They've spread throughout the world, obviously, by now. And you're starting to get a little bit more cooperation between different countries, more open exchange of ideas. So you have this real international film scene that had not really existed before. And the development of international film festivals, where films throughout the world could be screened and watched by audiences, that was a big part of that. So there were some big festivals established in the 50s that we still have today. Cannes in France, the Cannes Film Festival, that's in a city in France, the Venice Film Festival in Italy, and then later there would be more. There's one in Toronto, the Sundance Film Festival would later come along in the US, but these were some of the early ones, and they sort of helped to establish this new international film culture. Also, a lot of countries were getting government support to make movies after the war. That's never been so much the case in the US, but in other countries like the UK, France, other European countries, a lot of films would get funding through government programs or like, sort of like arts initiatives funded by those those governments. We've always been a little bit more of a free market movie producing nation here, but that government support helped a lot of European nations that were struggling. Again, the movie industries were kind of destroyed. They didn't have a lot of money. Individual producers, directors, they didn't have a lot of money. So in some cases, government support was needed. We didn't necessarily have that same issue here, but that was important in the sort of redevelopment of a lot of European film industries. But let's move back to Hollywood. So, what's going on here? We're also emerging from the war years. We don't have the same kind of local destruction to deal with, like I was saying, and our economy hasn't been wrecked in the same way that a lot of European countries were. So we're better off, obviously. Our movies keep churning, the industry keeps going, but big changes are happening and will continue to happen throughout the 50s. So, one thing I mentioned a few weeks ago that we'll talk about a little bit more next week with the rise of the new Hollywood is that the U.S. government decided that Hollywood was kind of an illegal monopoly. They had been monopolizing the film industry for decades, basically preventing competition, preventing people from outside the studio system of having a really good, fair opportunity to get their movies made, distributed, and exhibited. Remember, Hollywood controlled all of those levels of the industry. So they were kind of squeezing everybody else out. And that's not really allowed according to our laws and our sort of system of capitalism. So there was a big investigation launched by the Senate or the House or both, and they eventually determined that Hollywood was in violation of certain antitrust laws that we have on the books in the U.S. So these antitrust actions by like the end of the 50s would really weaken the Hollywood studios. Now, it's important to note the studios don't go away. The studios are not abolished. And in fact, to this day, we still have some of these studios and we have new studios. So the studio model was not, destroyed or dispensed with. It was just tweaked, it was altered, and it was determined that the studios couldn't have quite as much control. So they still had control, but not as much and not at all levels. So that was one of the big things that changed. You had this sort of divorce or this separation between production and exhibition. Remember, we talked weeks ago about how Hollywood studios would either sort of bully the owners of theaters using a practice called block booking, where they would make a theater buy basically all of their movies for that year, even if the theater just wanted to show one or two. If you wanted to get those one or two movies, you had to buy everything. So that was a way for the studio to make more money. And then in time, studios just started buying the theaters themselves. They just decided, let's be in charge of the theater side as well so we can control exhibition in addition to already controlling production and distribution. That was one of the big things the US government had a problem with. You can't control all three, right? So a lot of studios scaled back. They were no longer they no longer owned their own theater chains. In some cases, they weren't even distributing their own movies. So a lot of studios became just based on production. They were simply producing movies and then selling them to other distributors. So that vertical integration that really defined the golden age of Hollywood, controlling production, distribution, and exhibition, that stops, that ends in the 1950s. So the studios are weakened, and in the long run, it takes a while for this effect to really be felt. But in the long run, movie making sort of opens up in America. With the studios losing some power, that allows more independent film productions to start taking place. And we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. But this is quite revolutionary. It opens up more opportunities for people outside the studio system to get their movies made, distributed, and eventually shown to paying audiences. And this idea of independent film, it didn't really exist in the 1950s, but by the 60s and 70s, it very much did exist. And it's still a very important part of how we think of the American movie industry today. We still have a lot of studio movies, we still have a lot of studio production, but we also have independent movies. And they're often viewed differently. They often tackle different subject matter. They don't make as much money, but they're often more creative, more innovative, more daring in some ways. So that sort of distinction between studio movie making and independent movie making will become very important in the weeks to come. It's just starting here in the 50s. The full effects would not really be felt for a couple of more decades. But the book mentions that there's some other big changes that the studios had to reckon with during the 50s. It's not just the government deciding they're a monopoly that has to be broken up. There's some other stuff going on. One of the big ones to remember, and we'll talk about it a lot more in the weeks to come, is television. Okay, by the 1950s, most Americans had at least one television in their home. So this represents a big challenge to movies, a big competition, as you can imagine. And at first, the studios and movie makers in general were very hostile towards the new medium of television because they viewed it as a potential competition. And this really had a lot of different effects on a lot of different levels. So one thing that starts happening by the 50s is that fewer people are going to movie theaters. Fewer people are paying to go to the movies. And one reason for that is because of the rising popularity of TV. So increasingly, people were electing to stay home and watch TV shows. And later in the 50s, you could even watch movies at home. So that obviously changes things. That changes stuff on the business side, but as the book also points out, movies have to kind of adapt to television. And in time, movies would start to adopt a little bit of television's visual language. Movies would simplify some of their camera work and composition so their stuff would look better on a TV screen. A TV screen is obviously much smaller than a movie screen. So TV starts to really have an effect on how movies are made, marketed, and even watched, consumed. So that's big. We'll talk more about TV in the weeks to come. But just remember, the 50s, that's really the decade where television takes off. The technology had already existed previously, but it wasn't widespread. Right? It's kind of like the internet. It already existed before the mid-90s, but it's not until the mid to late 90s that everybody, or pretty much everybody, has access to the internet. Same with TV. TV actually existed before World War II in a more primitive form. And by the end of the 40s, you start to get commercial, TV sets that could be sold to individual people, but it's not till the 50s that TV's big. Everybody can watch TV. So that's obviously going to change things for movies as well. Also, more international competition. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, as some of these European film industries are doing cool stuff, getting back and running again post-war, there's a little bit more of a reciprocal relationship. Hollywood keeps exporting their movies to other countries, but increasingly, American viewers can watch international films. And of course, American directors and screenwriters are going to be influenced by some of what they're seeing coming out of European countries. So all of this is happening throughout the 50s. Big changes that will have major repercussions in the decades to come. A few other changes to note. By the 50s, Technicolor has lost its monopoly on the colorization process in American movies. Up until the 50s, Technicolor was pretty much the only show in town. It was the only option. But that changes. So Eastman Kodak is another company that comes along in the 50s, and they actually have a simpler, easier coloration process. So this means more movies are getting made in color. It used to be fairly expensive to make your movie in color. By the early 60s, that's no longer the case. Okay, by the start of the 60s, virtually all U.S. films would be in color, and that would continue to be the case. It still is the case. Of course, you can still find some black and white movies coming out every now and again. Some other things that we just accept as standard now that really developed in the 50s. You get the widescreen effect as it functions now in movie theaters. Also, multi-track stereo sound, which is very standard in movie theaters today. Those become industry standards by the 50s. Also, an important change, we talked about the old movie palaces, these really ornate, beautiful buildings where movies were shown back in the silent era into the early sound era. But by the 50s and 60s, a lot of those old movie palaces are gone. However, we're starting to get movie theaters in new places. So as people increasingly leave cities and move out to suburbs and newer communities built outside of cities, you're seeing more movie theaters also getting built in the suburbs. So this is often referred to as the rise of the multiplex. For most of you, if you've gone to see a movie at any point in your life, you've probably gone to a multiplex. That just means a movie theater where there are multiple screens. And these movie theaters are often found in shopping centers, malls. Sometimes they're standalone theaters, but they're usually close to other businesses, other kind of shopping or dining destinations. So we've all seen these kinds of movie theaters. These are usually where we go to watch movies. I'm kind of dating myself, but when I was growing up, the movie theater that we went to was in the local mall, right? This was the 90s. Malls were still a thing. People went to malls, big, huge shopping malls with a lot of stores, a lot of stuff. So our movie theater was just attached to the mall. So if you wanted to go to the theater, that's where you went. And there was a separate entrance, so you didn't have to deal with the whole mall. You could just go directly to the theater. That theater's gone. Like literally that entire building where I saw many of my earliest films, it's gone. It's been demolished. I believe they built condos there because people don't care about malls so much anymore. We do a lot of our shopping online. So that model, even like the 1990s suburban shopping mall movie theater, that model is even a little bit old-fashioned today. But you can imagine how popular of a way that was to watch movies for really the entire second half of the 20th century, the sort of modern suburban multiplex. And they still exist in largely the same form. They just might not be in malls so often now. Also, the drive-in, perhaps you've been to a drive-in theater before. That was also kind of synonymous with the 50s. This is also the rise of car culture, right? As we get more spread out, this isn't really a movie thing. It's just an interesting sort of development in the post-war world, post-war America. We spread out, right? We're leaving cities, we're moving to suburbs, and increasingly we become reliant on cars. We drive everywhere, right? And that's still very true of American life today. In the earlier 20th century, especially if you lived in New York, or Chicago, some other major city, it's likely you didn't drive or even have a car. You would, ride a train or a subway, or you would walk places. But in the post-war world, increasingly it was a car culture. So the new kinds of movie theaters were sort of built to accommodate people driving to them. So there's no longer a movie palace downtown, but now you can drive out to the suburbs, go to a movie theater. There's plenty of parking. You might not even have to leave your car if you go to a drive-in. So there's just sort of new ways of going to the movies, enjoying movies. Also, this happens a little bit later, but by the end of the 1960s, we finally have an age-based rating system. So I mentioned a few weeks ago the MPAA, a sort of governing body in charge of basically deciding if films were acceptable for release, if anything had to be censored or taken out. So starting in the 30s, we started to get some kind of strict rules about what you could or could not show in movies. And a lot of, stuff that would have been perceived as sexual content, excessive violence, certain kinds of profanity, were basically just never allowed in any kind of mainstream Hollywood movie. Now, European films had slightly looser standards. We started noticing that in the 50s. They could get away with stuff that would not have, slipped by the censors in Hollywood. But it's really not until the 60s that we get an age-based rating system. And this is actually important in terms of how movies are marketed and even how movies get made, because an age-based rating system allows directors and screenwriters and producers to kind of figure out who their demographic is going to be and what kind of potentially objectionable stuff they're going to put in their movie. So if it's a PG movie, right, you're not going to be able to get away with much. But if it's a rated R movie, obviously there might be more violence, there might be sexual content, there's going to be more profanity probably, and people know going in, okay, this is rated R, these are the reasons why it's rated R, and then the audience can make decisions about whether or not they want to watch it. Of course, when we were kids, the rating system mattered because a lot of parents wouldn't let you watch a movie if it was rated R. If it was PG-13 and you're a teenager, it's probably okay. So a lot of kids are trying to watch movies that their parents don't let them watch. And those rating systems are still with us. We still use them for any theatrically released movie. So all of this stuff, we would kind of refer to all of these things as basic aspects of modern cinema. But it's not until the 50s and 60s that they really become standard. So I want to go back to TV and just mention a couple of things that happened, some big events in the 50s that we can keep track of. So a big move, a big shift occurs in 1954 as far as movies' relationship with TV. So like I said, initially, a lot of studios didn't want anything to do with TV. But in 1954, Howard Hughes, the kind of famous, eccentric American millionaire, who also happened to be an owner of RKO, one of the big old traditional Hollywood studios. I think we've seen a movie or two from them. I think last week's movie was at least distributed by RKO. Citizen Kane was made by RKO. So one of the old studios. Hughes makes a decision in 1954 to sell the studio's entire film library. So every film that studio had ever produced, he sold that whole film library to TV stations. There were only a few back then. You had ABC, CBS, and NBC. Most people only had 3 channels back in the 50s. But Hughes sold the film library to the TV stations so they could show RKO movies on their channels. And he was really the first studio head to do that. And after 1954, other studios followed suit and started selling their properties to TV. So TV could then air the movies later on. So this began a tradition that still exists today, where TV stations will air movies, but only after the movie has its theatrical release, right? So I know most people don't watch like traditional TV anymore, but you can still go to one of the major networks, or you can go to a channel like TNT or TBS or USA, and they'll often show movies that have already played in theaters. So in some cases they might be older movies, but in other cases they're pretty recent. Maybe they came out just a couple of years ago, or they came out last year. But usually the TV stations have to wait until the movie is no longer playing in theaters. So once its theatrical run is over, it's kind of eligible to be shown on TV. Of course, our whole model for watching movies is quite a bit different now because we have streaming. And we have so many other ways to watch movies. So you guys know this firsthand. You can imagine that even fewer people are going to the movies now because you can just stream a new release on your laptop. Right? An option that was not available to us 2 or 3 decades ago. So again, in the old days, if you couldn't make it to see a movie in theaters, and if you grew up in kind of a small, mid-sized town, as I did, a lot of movies didn't come there, right? You weren't going to be able to see everything. So a lot of times you were waiting for it to come on TV. But you'd have to wait maybe 6 months, a year, in some cases, before you could catch it on one of your TV stations. But now, we don't have to wait. If you want to stream a new release, you can watch it on your personal device at the same time that it's playing in theaters. That might seem kind of like a minor thing, or it's very obvious to you guys, but that's a big change, right? And it continues this half-century long development of movie theaters kind of losing traction. We still like to go to the movies. It's still an experience, certainly for certain kinds of movies, big spectacles. We still do it, but we do it less and less as we get all of these other home entertainment options. So TV was really the first step in that direction. Now we have so many other options, but TV really was the first big one that could rival and compete with movies. Another big thing that happens in the 50s, by around the middle of the 50s, you start having movies specifically made for TV. So the phenomenon of the made-for-TV movie. Again, we still see these. These still exist. I don't think they're as popular anymore. But for a long time, that was a staple of TV programming. You would have certain movies that were made just for CBS or just for TNT or whatever the channel happened to be. And they would sometimes be viewed as a little bit cheaper, a little bit lesser quality than theatrical releases, but not always. Some TV movies were actually pretty good. And as you got more and more channels in the decades to come over the course of the later 20th century, you got more and more movies being made specifically to air on TV. And then, of course, with the rise of HBO and other premium channels in the 80s, they start making their own movies. And a lot of those movies were pretty good. So all of this kind of progression, all of this really gets started in the 50s. So as I mentioned, movies have to accommodate TV. They don't want to at first. They're very resistant initially, but they have no choice. So there's a couple of different ways that they start to accommodate the smaller size of the TV screen and the fact that a lot of people are increasingly watching movies at home on their TV. So one thing that happens is they kind of become a little bit visually simpler. The book talks about this. It's kind of a simplification of movies' visual language or visual techniques. So they mention how the center of the frame becomes the focus for most action on screen, because that would translate to a smaller screen. Right? If everything was centered in the frame, then that was going to translate whether the screen was big or if it was small. And if you ever watch stuff from the 50s or see old movies set in the 50s, just get a load of how small their TVs were. We have really been spoiled by the proliferation of big screen TVs. That's not really a thing until the late 20th century. For a long time, TV screens were very, very small. Very small. So you had to accommodate that. Also, you had to accommodate commercial breaks, which would be a staple of TV broadcast. You don't have to worry about that in a movie theater, but increasingly directors and producers would kind of develop a sense of how to structure a movie, how to edit a movie in a way that would lend itself to periodic commercial breaks when that movie would later air on TV. And of course, if you were making a movie specifically for TV, you know right from the jump that there's going to be commercials. So you have to adjust to that. Also, the influence from Europe was pretty big. We already mentioned the rise of kind of neo-realism, more realistic styles, more realistic stories. But another thing that we picked up from a lot of European directors is what the book kind of refers to as a looser narrative style. So what does that mean? Just looser in terms of structure and what we might call causation. So if you watch a lot of Hollywood movies from the golden age, the golden era of both the silent film and the early sound film eras, you notice a lot of happy endings, plots that are pretty clear and chronological and easy to follow. That stuff continues to be pretty common after the war, but we're starting to experiment a little bit more. We're noticing what a lot of European films are doing, and they're a lot more open-ended, a little bit more ambiguous, and that starts to seep over into Hollywood movies. A little bit less of a direct linkage between narrative events. Remember, this was a hallmark of narrative filmmaking as it first developed back in the very first years of the 20th century. This idea that one shot should lead logically to the next shot, one action should follow logically the previous action. So we're establishing continuity, we're establishing a sense of realism so we can suspend our disbelief and sort of accept what's happening on screen as real, at least for a while. But we start to realize in the 50s increasingly that sometimes things in real life are strange, and sometimes things happen seemingly at random. Sometimes we don't always understand the direct cause and effect relationship between one event and the next. And again, this is a result of the war too. Wars have a tendency to kind of destabilize things, make people sort of adopt a different way of thinking. And this kind of embrace of more ambiguity, both on the level of character and on the level of plot. Sometimes things are strange. Sometimes it takes longer to understand. So we start seeing that more in the 50s and certainly in the 60s, right? Events that don't immediately add up, but later we might be able to figure it out. Also, less closure. That's really what we mean by happy ending. A happy ending, everything is, all loose ends are tied up. The characters are well situated. Conflict has been resolved, the audience is made happy, and we have that nice sense of closure, everything's done, and we move on. But of course, after the war, we might be more likely to think that's not always how life goes. Not everybody gets that sort of happy resolution. So more open-ended endings that aren't always necessarily happy, increasingly confused characters, alienated characters that might not feel at home in society. They often feel a lot of mixed emotions about things. Also, on the level of editing, moving away from always having that strict continuity editing and incorporating more jump cuts where one shot might not lead directly and logically to the next shot, but it can still make sense to readers. Maybe we're capturing a different kind of reality. Maybe it's dream logic. Maybe this person is confused about what's going on, so they're not quite following everything clearly. Just sort of capturing different psychological states and doing some newer, more innovative things with how stories are told, also the technical side of movie making. So, like I said, a lot of this is coming from Europe. A lot of this, though, is just kind of coming out of a post-war movement or a post-war moment where people are feeling a little shell-shocked, a little disillusioned. Some of their ideals have been exposed as false. We're entering a new era, a new sort of world. And certainly technology's changing, art is changing, and movies are changing too. So as the book says, this is kind of a transition period, as that older studio model, that old Hollywood system of factory efficiency that had really been dominant since the 1920s, right? It's had about a 30-year reign on top where there was really no significant competition. That's starting to change. That old studio model is beginning to be replaced by a still a studio model, but a newer, more flexible studio model that could accommodate new filmmakers and new styles. So that takes us to On the Waterfront, which comes out in 1954. Directed by Elia Kazan, who's a pretty famous American director, got his start in plays, the stage. Kind of an interesting guy. We're not going to get too far into his bio, but I will mention a little bit about it because he was kind of a controversial figure during the 1950s. He was Greek. He was actually born in Turkey to Greek parents, but they immigrated to the U.S. when he was young. And he got later sort of caught up in like the anti-communist hysteria that was going on during the 50s, another thing that was happening in the post-war world. So he's pretty famous for reasons both good and bad. The protagonist, the star of the film, is also pretty famous. Marlon Brando, you've probably heard of him. He's still regarded today as one of America's great movie actors. And this is arguably his greatest role, or at least one of his greatest roles. The performance that made him a huge star in American movies. And he would continue to be a big star for decades. He plays Terry Malloy, the main character. And it's just generally thought of as one of the best American movies really ever. If you go to like AFI or any of these other websites where they like rank the movies and like have their top 100 lists of American movies, On the Waterfront usually features pretty high. It's usually in the top 10 or somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's a great American film. It also represents a lot of what's going on with American filmmaking in the 1950s. So it's black and white, it's gritty, it's realistic, right? Largely shot on location. Kazan didn't really want to mess around with sound stages or elaborate sets. They wanted to actually film the movie where it was set. And it is set in Hoboken, New Jersey. That's a real place right across the river from New York City. And part of what makes this movie seem rather realistic is the story itself, because the story was ripped directly from the headlines. So the screenplay of this movie, written by Bud Schulberg, was actually based on a series of newspaper articles published in Hoboken. I think some might have been published in New York as well, documenting corruption and the presence of the mafia on the New Jersey waterfront. So, like when we talk about the waterfront, we're talking about the docks, we're talking about longshoremen or stevedores, the guys who made their living unloading boats, basically bringing all the freight off the boats and stacking them on the docks where they could then be put into trucks and driven out to be, placed into stores or sold or whatever. So this used to be a huge industry. Nowadays, most of it's automated. Like if you go to a big harbor or like a big shipyard, nowadays you see most of this work getting done by robots. But for a long time, this hard, physical, manual labor was done by longshoremen. And in lots of places where there were lots of longshoremen, there would be longshoremen unions. Unions where the individual longshoremen would pay dues, and the unions would kind of help protect them or, help them negotiate for higher wages, kind of give them some employment security, and give them some advocacy for maybe better working conditions or more money or whatever. But one thing that happens in a lot of northern cities where there's lots of organized crime, this is true in places like Boston, the greater New York area, Philadelphia, any place like that, a lot of the longshoremen unions would be sort of infiltrated or taken over by organized crime. Sometimes referred to as the mafia. It wasn't always necessarily the mafia. The mafia is kind of specific to Italian American criminals. It could have been other groups, but this was happening a lot throughout post-war America. There was sort of this intense focus on organized crime, which had existed for a long time. I mean, the mafia had been around really going back to the late 1800s. But there's more reporting done. There's sort of more work being done on the problem by this post-war moment. And we're getting more of a concentrated response from law enforcement, government starting to get more involved, trying to crack down on organized crime. If you guys watch The Godfather, this is documented very well in that movie. The 50s and 60s really saw the end of like sort of traditional organized crime and like the peak years of the mafia in a lot of American cities, because there was this real concerted effort to bring this stuff down or to sort of reduce this. So anyway, that's all going on. Right. And we have a series of newspaper articles in the 1950s that document the corruption and the violence and the presence of organized crime in the longshoremen unions in Hoboken, which again is a city right outside of New York, in New Jersey. Also famous for being the hometown of Frank Sinatra. All right. So this was really happening. This is not just a fictional scenario dreamed up by a screenwriter. This was really going on. So Schulberg bases this story very much on real events, real people, and he's using that reporting, some of which he did himself. Schulberg was a newspaper writer in addition to being a screenwriter. He was frequently known as being a sports reporter, wrote a lot about boxing and other popular sports of the middle of the 20th century. So anyway, a real life basis for the story. Okay, that's part of it. Also, in order to really capture it, Kazan wants to go and film on location in Hoboken, which wasn't super common for a Hollywood movie back then. Like we said, most Hollywood movies, regardless of where they were set, they were filmed in Hollywood on a soundstage, often indoors. They might get some location shots, here and there, but a lot of the action would be done in a more controlled environment. But we wanted something different here, right? We're trying to capture the real conditions of post-war Hoboken. We're trying to capture this real problem with organized crime. So let's go there. Let's shoot on location. Let's actually see the waterfront in Hoboken. And let's get some actors who really seem like they could maybe be from Hoboken. So that's where Marlon Brando's performance comes in. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Brando because he is so famous and because he kind of represents this style of acting that really becomes dominant in American film after World War II. It's frequently referred to as method acting. I might have mentioned it before when we talked about changes in acting technique over the years. So we saw one big change after silent films go away and sound films are ushered in. We noticed that acting becomes a little bit less exaggerated. They don't have to emote quite as much with sound. They don't have to do so many exaggerated gestures and facial expressions. So we noticed that, and I think we're generally pretty appreciative of that. But another thing that's kind of imported from Europe after the war, really even before the war, as early as the 1930s, is this acting method that comes from Russia. And it's sometimes referred to or like named after the guy who sort of created it in Russia, this guy named Stanislavski. So it's sometimes called the Stanislavski method or system. He was a stage director in Russia. Maybe even before the communist revolution. I don't know. He was still there once they became the Soviet Republic, the Soviet Union. But he was sort of a theorist of acting, and he was a stage director. But he also wrote books about acting, sort of giving advice or directions to actors. And he comes up with this basic idea that there's a lot of different kinds of acting. Most of it he thought was bad. But the two kind of main types that he was interested in, that he mostly wrote about, he called it experiencing a role versus representing a role. And we got a lot of Stanislavski stuff wrong because, translation, he never worked in America. He was always over there. So we kind of misunderstood some of what he was saying. But he actually doesn't have a problem with either of these two styles. But he's saying that one style is the future, the other style is the past. So he talks about a role being sort of representational as the way a lot of great actors used to do it. Right? So that's kind of the classical way of acting, both on stage and in the movies. And the idea is the actor does sort of embody the character, and the actor obviously imagines that they are the character, they inhabit the character, but only during rehearsal. During rehearsals, as they're practicing and getting everything sort of ready for the real performance, they inhabit the character. They produce a performance that can be considered realistic and good. And then they're separate from the character, right? Then when it's time to actually go out for opening night, again, he's talking about the theater, really. So when they're out there on opening night and they're actually on stage acting, there's now a separation between the actor and the character that the actor is playing, right? The character is separate. The character is not the actor, right? The actor is representing the character, but they are two separate entities, right? So through all the rehearsal, through all the practice, memorizing the lines, doing all of that, the actor has created a performance that the actor can now replicate as many times as they need to. We're going to be in Moscow tonight. We're going to be in St. Petersburg next week. It's going to be the same performance, right? I've already got it down. I know how I represent this role, this character. So I'm going to keep doing it, right? And that's fine. And Stanislavski said that's a lot of good actors do that. And that's fine. That's how great acting has often been done. But he argued that there was a better way. He said the best way, the most natural way to act, to capture a role, to capture a character, is what he called experiencing the role. That means there can't really be a separation between the actor and the character. So the actor still rehearses, the actor still memorizes their lines, imagines what it might be like to be the character. But then when they get up on stage to perform, every performance is going to be a little bit different because in some ways, the actor is the character. They're not just practicing or sort of regurgitating a pre-made performance that they've already done, right? They're improvising a little bit. Again, each performance might be different because they're more reactive. They're responding to what's happening, but they're responding the way their character would, right? They're responding the way their character would in any given situation. So depending on what another actor might do, or somebody might out in the audience coughs, or somebody drops something on stage, that could elicit a different response from the character. That could create a slightly different performance. So there's a little bit of improvisation involved, but the bigger point that he's making is when you're fully inhabiting the character, right? Your performance is not pre-made and reheatable, right? It's always going to be new. It's alive. It's different depending on different circumstances and different situations. So it allows the actor to be more sort of quick on their feet. It allows them to be more natural, and they really are the character for that moment, for those 2 hours that they're on stage or in front of the camera, right? So this idea that there is no separation. When you're performing, you are the character, right? So that's the basic idea. Now, we've taken that basic idea and it's kind of gotten a little bit exaggerated in a lot of popular publications and the way people talk about this. So in some cases now, when we discuss method actors, there's kind of an idea that they stay in character like all the time, even when they're not shooting, even when they're not on, working in front of the camera, so they can fully inhabit the character. There's this idea that they just have to stay in character. I don't know that that's always true. I think some people do that a little bit, but there's lots of like funny stories about famous method actors who wouldn't answer to their own name. They would insist that people call them by their character name. They would keep their character's accent or dialect, again, even when they weren't on set, when they weren't filming. That's a bit exaggerated. You don't have to do all of that to be a method actor. Really, what method acting boils down to is how you rehearse and then how you actually perform. There's really no rules about what you're doing during your free time. But Marlon Brando was one of many sort of famous method actors that sort of rose to prominence in the 50s. And there were many others after him. So he worked with Stella Adler, who was a student of Stanislavski. And Stella Adler worked in New York City. She was an actress and sort of an acting coach, and also somebody who, like Stanislavski, wrote about acting. And she helped run the Actor Studio, which still exists. It's like an actor sort of training program in New York City. And she worked closely with Marlon Brando, and then later Robert De Niro, Warren Beatty, some other famous actors of the new Hollywood era. Brando was a little bit older than them, but she works with all of those actors, and she's one of these like well-known sort of adherents of the method acting style. But really what she sort of stressed, and this was common for any method actor, was just an authentic performance, right? Responding to things based on the character, right? So one of her big sort of innovations, or one of the big things she wrote about, is she said in any performance, the actor needs to sort of stimulate emotions based on what the character would be feeling. Like in the old days, in a more representational acting style, an actor might be told, hey, your character's really upset in this scene, right? You're going to have to cry in this scene, or, really emote. So think about something terrible that happened to you when you were a kid. Like think about your dog dying, right? You would try to tap into something that happened to you, the real person, the actor, and then that could make you feel an emotion that you could then perform, as part of your role. But Adler said that's not really authentic, right? So if Marlon Brando as Terry Malloy is crying about something that happened to Marlon Brando, not Terry Malloy, that's not authentic. That's not realistic, right? In order to really be Terry Malloy, any emotional response that Brando is producing, it has to be based on Malloy's feelings, how Terry feels, what's happened in Terry's life, right? So that's a way to have a more authentic performance. Instead of taking experiences from the actor's own life, the actors should take the experience from the character's imagined life. So again, we can, if you're not careful, this can kind of veer into silly territory, but this is the reason why actors like Brando would want to know more about their character. What's his story? What's he gone through? Even if it wasn't specifically in the screenplay, right? He might have a conversation with Schulberg, the writer, or with Kazan. What's happened to Malloy? Like, what are some triggers for him? What are some things that would upset him? How might he respond to this situation? Again, basing it all on the character. And again, this idea that Brando's not just going to create one performance for Malloy that he can just churn out and replicate whenever he wants. He's going to be responsive. He is Malloy when he's acting. So whatever he's doing, that's what Malloy would do. That's what Terry would do. Right? Whereas the old school actors would say, no, I'm acting, right? I'm not the person. I'm an actor pretending to be the person. And they're always aware of that. Whereas with a method actor, that distinction between me and the character, that's gone, at least while I'm shooting, at least while I'm up on stage. So hopefully that makes sense. That's really what the method acting style is, and that would become a really dominant sort of acting style in the decades to come, Brando being one of the early examples. So I'll just read a very brief description that I got from the internet, a nice summary of the movie, and a couple of reasons why it remains so important even today. So this is very much like a breathless press release that might have accompanied the movie when it first came out. Marlon Brando gives the performance of his career as the tough prize fighter turned longshoreman Terry Malloy in this masterpiece of urban poetry. A raggedly emotional tale of individual failure and social corruption on the waterfront follows Terry's deepening moral crisis as he must decide whether to remain loyal to the mob-connected union boss, Johnny Friendly, played by Lee J. Cobb, and Johnny's right-hand man, Terry's brother, Charlie, played by Rod Steiger, as the authorities close in on them. Driven by the vivid, naturalistic direction of Elia Kazan and savory, streetwise dialogue by Bud Schulberg, On the Waterfront was an instant sensation, winning 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, that was Brando, Best Supporting Actress, that was Eva Marie Saint, who plays his girlfriend, and Best Screenplay for Schulberg. So just a little summary of the movie and a few reasons why people are still such big fans. Again, it's tapping into a lot of important cultural stuff during the 50s. It's kind of a bleak movie. You'll notice as you're watching, it's a bit depressing. Things are not going great for Terry. He used to be a boxer. His career ended badly. Now he's a longshoreman. He's kind of viewed as a loser by a lot of people in his life, sort of condescended to, kind of treated as lesser than. Eventually, he has to make a tough decision. He knows that his union is wrapped up with the mob. He knows that his own brother is wrapped up with the mob. He himself is just kind of indirectly involved. Like, they give him some jobs to do. We see how that plays out with Eva Marie Saint's character and her brother, right? But Terry isn't really portrayed as a bad guy. He's not sort of a natural born criminal. He's a guy that's kind of fallen on hard times, doesn't have a lot of great options, and he's sort of sucked into this criminal world because that's mostly what he knows. That's what his brother wants for him, and he doesn't have a lot of ability. At least when we first meet him, he doesn't seem to have a lot of ability to get out. And of course, there's the famous "I could have been a contender" speech, which really captures his dilemma. And it's also one of these moments where people think Brando is really capturing an authentic portrait of what this guy is, who this guy is, and what his life is like. So you can watch for that. Does the performance strike you as realistic? Does Brando's performance seem natural, real, and authentic? Also, you can think about what they call the vivid naturalistic direction of Kazan. Again, that means on location shooting. There's some violence in this movie that would have been a little bit shocking to some audiences in the 50s. Probably doesn't seem that violent to us, but it's a little bit more violent than a mainstream movie would have been back then. And it's not very sentimental. It's not romanticized. We don't get everything working out just right. This is messy. People's lives are messy. Corruption and crime are messy. Terry and his decision making is messy, right? It's not all clear. It's not always morally clear. There's not always easy answers and clear resolutions, which again is increasingly typical of what we see in movies. A little bit morally ambiguous, and there's a connection back to Kazan. So ultimately, I hope I'm not giving anything away, Terry decides that he needs to inform on his brother in this criminal organization that has infiltrated the Longshoremen Union. And of course, that's not an easy thing to do. That's going to make him a target. That makes him, that obviously sort of compromises his brother in various ways. It puts Terry in danger. It's the reason why he resists doing it for a long time. So a lot of people see an echo in Terry's situation when you look at Kazan's own bio. So just a little bit of history here. Something else that's going on in the 1950s was the Hollywood blacklist. So some of you might remember from history class learning about Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare during the 1950s. So McCarthy was a senator who was convinced that there were a bunch of communists serving in the U.S. government and also making a lot of U.S. movies and doing a lot of other important political, economic, and cultural work. So the Red Scare was this sort of general kind of hysterical reaction to this idea that there were lots of secret commies that needed to be rooted out of American life. And one place that was really targeted was Hollywood. There was a lot of rumors and a lot of belief that there were a lot of communists working for Hollywood studios, directing movies, writing screenplays, even working as actors. There's a lot of reasons for that connection that we don't have to get into. A lot of it was a little bit of anti-Semitism. A lot of studio heads were Jewish. A lot of them maybe had roots in Europe. Some of them might have sort of favored left-wing politics at some time or another. So there were some reasons, not many good reasons, but Hollywood really got targeted as part of this sort of attempt to root out communism. So the House, what's it called? The House Un-American Activities Committee had all of these hearings where they basically got a bunch of big name producers, directors, and screenwriters to give testimony, to go up in front of this congressional committee and answer questions. Many people refused to answer questions. They refused to incriminate themselves or to implicate anyone else. And they weren't breaking any laws by doing that. It's not against the law to be a communist in the U.S., not even in the 50s, but they would often be blacklisted. So if they wouldn't cooperate with the investigation, a lot of those filmmakers would not be allowed to work in Hollywood again. They wouldn't get any contracts. They wouldn't get any offers to make new movies. So they would be effectively removed without it being, this sort of official process. So a lot of important directors, writers, even some actors got blacklisted, not allowed to work, at least not for a while. Many of them were able to come back later. Kazan gets called in front of this congressional committee, and unlike many others, he agrees to name names. So, in other words, he admits that he himself had previously belonged to the Communist Party back in the 30s when he was much younger, and he also names a lot of other important Hollywood figures who also were either previous members of the party or were still current members. So, as you can imagine, that pissed a lot of people off in Hollywood. He ruined some people's careers, and in many cases, what he was informing on was somebody might have been in the Communist Party like 20 years ago. And like Kazan, they might have left the party and had nothing more to do with it, but because of this previous association, they would get blacklisted. So a lot of his former friends in the film industry disowned him, would no longer speak to him. They thought he was a traitor. They thought he was, disloyal for giving up so many of his former friends and colleagues. But from Kazan's perspective, he thought communism really was a bad thing. He thought it really was a threat to American life. So he was like, hey, I'm doing what I think is right. So some people can draw a parallel between Kazan's situation with the blacklist and Malloy. Sort of forced to make this difficult decision. Are you going to inform on people close to you and get them either arrested or at least hurt professionally? Or are you going to remain silent and it might get worse for you? That's a decision that both of them have to face. All right, so let's wrap up by just talking very briefly about the upcoming paper, the midterm essay. You have two options when it comes to deadline, due date. So in Canvas, I have the deadline as the end of this week, March 23rd, the end of week 8. But again, as I've said, after week 8, we have spring break at GBC. So we are out of class for a full week. So if you want to use spring break to continue working and finishing up the paper, that's fine. You can submit on March 30th. All right. Don't overthink the paper, okay? It is an analysis. You guys have done analysis before. Maybe you haven't analyzed movies, but you've analyzed other things, okay? So you can pick anything that we've watched so far up to week 8, and I want you to arrive at an original interpretation of the movie. Now, let me be clear. That is not the same thing as a summary of the movie. I don't need summaries. I've seen all of these movies, and I know what happens. I want you guys to interpret the meaning of the movie. Don't just tell me what happens in the plot. That's easy. Tell me what the movie means to you. Arrive at an original conclusion that can stand as your interpretation of the movie. So think more about meaning, not just what happens, but what does it all mean? And think about two sides of movies. We have our traditional kind of literary elements, stuff like character, plot, setting, obviously theme, the larger messages, the larger meanings. We can talk about all of that. But also, remember, movies have their own technical language. They have their own technical elements that are unique to movies. So think about camera work. Think about lighting. Think about mise-en-scene, everything that's visible outside of the camera work. So think about set design. Think about costumes. Think about hair. Think about writing. Think about acting. Think about editing or even music. All of these other elements that we've been looking at in our movies. If you have questions, let me know. Good luck, and read the assignment instructions. I'm trying to be clear. If there's anything still unclear, let's talk more. And I will see you guys after the break.